What is State Question 790 about? Probably 9 out of 10 people say that's the Ten Commandments one, but it's a lot bigger than that. And if I can provide just a little bit of background for you, I'd like to do that. First, I want to tell you a story of a boy named Wyatt. Wyatt was born in Tulsa 9 weeks early, so he struggled from very early on in life. In fact, the doctor told his parents he probably won't make it. He did, but he continued to struggle. As he developed, as he went to school, he wasn't like the other kids. He had hearing problems. He had problems paying attention. Later it was discovered that Wyatt had some severe learning disabilities and developmental disabilities. He was in public schools where he was bullied on the bus, on the playground, in the classroom, physically assaulted. His parents begged the public school, please provide services for our son. Try and help us find some sort of educational program where he can learn. And the public school that they were in just did not have anything available for them. Well, the legislature had passed the Lindsay Nicole Henry scholarships, and it was meant to serve people like Wyatt and his family. And the purpose behind that is to provide a scholarship so that children that are in public schools that don't have the services they need could then go to a school that does. And the scholarship, provided by state money, would help pay for that. Named after the late daughter of Governor Henry, who signed that legislation. Unfortunately, the school district where Wyatt was located sued, and his family and other families had to wait while they battled it out in court because they said that scholarship violated the Oklahoma Constitution, Article 2, Section 5. That's known as the Blaine Amendment. Blaine Amendments were popular in the mid-1800s to the early 20th century. They were discriminatory in nature, broadly written, meant to be defined by the legislatures in various states however they wanted to define them, mainly to keep Catholicism from spreading and having influence in the states, and as our country grew towards the west. Oklahoma's Constitution includes this Blaine Amendment, Article 2, Section 5. What happened is Article 2, Section 5, the Blaine Amendment, really has been kind of sleeping comfortably, withering on the vine for the last several decades until the case of the Ten Commandments came up, the Prescott case. What happened is the Supreme Court defined Article 2, Section 5 in such a manner that the inclusion of a monument to the Ten Commandments, despite the fact that that's been located in city parks, on other state capitals, despite the fact that a monument to the Ten Commandments sits in the U.S. Supreme Court building, despite that, Article 2, Section 5 of the Oklahoma Constitution made that illegal, just the presence of a monument. The historical nature of the Ten Commandments was irrelevant. The context of the Ten Commandments monument, irrelevant. Essentially, the court interpreted so broadly, it said, because the Ten Commandments has some sort of religious meaning to some sort of religious group, its inclusion on the state capitol grounds is against the Oklahoma Constitution, despite the fact it was paid for by private funds. Well, the legislature, in trying to respond to this, had several different things that we could look at. How do we fix this problem? If this is how the court defines Article 2, Section 5 of the Blaine Amendment, how do we fix this? This is such a poor decision. The written decision of the court was only about 2 pages long. It was a 7-2 vote. This is such a poor decision that has such broad and far-reaching implications, including, like I talked about, the Lindsay Nicole Henry scholarships. How do we fix this? And in talking to several different groups, several different people, considering all the options, the only way to address this is to essentially get rid of the Blaine Amendment. Now again, with it having its discriminatory purpose in the first place, that's not a bad idea. Still have the protections of the First Amendment, of course. As we talked about, those first 16 words in the Bill of Rights, that Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof. Under the Oklahoma Supreme Court's interpretation of Article 2, Section 5, there's virtually no monument, piece of art, or public display that could not be found to violate the Blaine Amendment. Let me give you an example and then I'll sit down. The state flag of Oklahoma. How many of you are familiar with the state flag of Oklahoma? All right, most of us. Let's talk about the symbols on the state flag of Oklahoma. One of the ones that jumps out is the sacred pipe, or what's known as the calumet. This is one of the most sacred objects in most Native American spirituality, especially to the Plains Indians in Oklahoma. It was used in prayer services. It was used to essentially help your spirit transcend to touch the Almighty. That's got to go. Under the Oklahoma Supreme Court opinion, the calumet, the sacred pipe, must go from the state flag. But there's also an olive branch on there. Olive branch has been used again for centuries to represent peace. Now, does that come because of its usage in Greek religion, or a Christian, or a Jewish faith tradition? According to the Supreme Court, it doesn't matter. It has a religious meaning. The olive branch has to go. So we're left with the Osage shield. Of course, it has the eagle feathers that hang from it. Those are sacred in Osage culture. The eagle feathers have to go. Okay, so now we have the orange shield with the white crosses left on it. Well, the crosses, of course, just represent stars to the Native Americans, but the cross could definitely have a religious meaning. The crosses have to go. So now what we're left with is a blue flag with an orange circle that says Oklahoma. Okay, this is not an extreme example, guys. This is the logical extension of the Supreme Court's ruling in Prescott. The elimination of the Blaine Amendment, Article 2, Section 5, means that we don't have to completely disassemble our state flag. Let me answer one question that seems to come up all the time. Okay, if you have the Ten Commandments monument at the state capitol, then that opens the door for the Satanist monument, or the monument to the great spaghetti monster, as somebody put it to me. Absolutely not true. That was dealt with by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2009 in the Pleasant Grove case. It was a situation in Utah where there was a Ten Commandments monument in the city park. There was another religious sect, a pagan sect, that said you have to accept our monument. The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you don't. So again, that's been argued before. That's been brought up many times as well. If you have that there, you have to accept all of them. That's absolutely untrue. That's been decided. I look forward to answering any of your questions on State Question 790 and would encourage you to vote yes.
There we go. Are we on? All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. And like Representative Grau, I want to thank the audience and American Democracy Project for the invitation. I just want to say I learned so much doing research on this topic that was just remarkable. And so I am delighted to be here with you tonight to address this very important topic regarding 790. Now, you heard a story that was very compelling and very well thought out. But I'm here to tell you, as the illustrious Paul Harvey said, there is another side to the story, or a rest of the story. So, let me begin. On September the 12th, 1960, Democratic presidential nominee John F. Kennedy addressed the Greater Houston Ministerial Association in response to a concern by Protestant ministers that the president's Roman Catholic faith might deeply influence his possible presidency. You'll remember that Kennedy was our first Catholic president. While Kennedy's remarks are broader than we have time for this evening, listen to this moment in his speech. So it is apparently necessary for me to state once again not what kind of church I believe in, for that should be important only to me, but what kind of America I believe in. I believe in America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister should tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference. The separation of church and state, which Kennedy alludes to in his speech, recalls the efforts by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The two founding fathers exhaustively argued for religious liberty and church-state separation in the state of Virginia. Jefferson had already penned the bill for establishing religious liberty for the state of Virginia in 1779 before he left for France. Madison was left to fight for the passage of that law, which was opposed by fellow Virginian Patrick Henry. Henry wanted to pass a state tax that would support teachers of the Christian religion. Madison disagreed with such accommodations, writing his masterful work, Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. In this work, Madison argues the preservation of a free government requires not merely that the needs and bounds which separate each department of power are invariably maintained, but more especially that neither of them be suffered to overlap the great barrier which defends the rights of the people. The rulers who are guilty of such encroachment, he goes on, exceeds commission from which they derive their authority, and Madison's words are tyrants. The people who submit to it are slaves. Now, I agree, Madison's words sting, but he and Jefferson won the day in the state of Virginia. The Virginia state or statute for establishing religious freedom was adopted in 1786, 5 years before the First Amendment was even adopted. Now, Madison would take up his pen once again, as we all know, and he is the main author of the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The first 16 words of the First Amendment read as follows, and they have already been stated here. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Sacred first 16 words of the Constitution, or the Bill of Rights. With the brilliance of these two clauses, known as the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, the founders ensured there would remain what Madison called a barrier between church and state. Following the success of the state law in Virginia, the federal government followed suit. The new federal government would not establish, endorse, nor favor any religion. However, they also preserved the responsibility to ensure each citizen was able to practice or not practice their faith as their conscience dictated. For these two sacred clauses to be protected under the law, a barrier or a wall of separation had to be erected for a free church to exist within a free state. After Jefferson became president in 1800, Baptists from Danbury, Connecticut, wrote asking the newly elected president for his support on religious liberty. While some states and federal governments had adopted religious liberty rights, it was difficult in some other parts of the country within certain states to apply this right. The president wrote back to the Danbury Baptists, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion and prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. The United States President writing to Baptists in the state of Connecticut. Now, with other state and federal laws established, I'd like to turn our attention to what was mentioned a moment ago, to Oklahoma, the Blaine Amendment, the Constitution of Sequoyah, and the Enabling Act and the Oklahoma Constitution. The 1875 Blaine Amendment was a failed attempt by U.S. Congressman James Blaine of Maine. Say that 10 times fast. He wrote it to prohibit states from financially supporting private religious schools. While the amendment failed on a federal level, states began to adopt similar language, but not exact language, into their state constitutions. Oklahoma added their language in 1907, as you know, but let's not rush to judgment and call this a Blaine Amendment per se, because there is more to the story. Supporters of SQ 790 argue that Article 2, Section 5 of the Oklahoma Constitution is tied directly to the Blaine Amendment and the congressman's anti-Catholic motives. Supporters are correct that Blaine was most likely anti-Catholic. But to condemn every state's provision that upholds religious liberty by protecting it with a wall of separation is an overreach. For example, it would be like throwing out the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution because Jefferson and Madison were both slaveholders. And while we're at it, we might as well knock down the Washington Monument as well. Now, while Article 2, Section 5, in my opinion, was not influenced by the Blaine Amendment, don't take my word for it. In the case that prompted this state question, Prescott versus the Oklahoma Historical Preservation Commission, Oklahoma Supreme Court justices authored a majority opinion, 7-2, like the representative said, on July 27, 2015. The justices concluded, in their own words, it is apparent from a comparison of the Oklahoma Constitution that the Blaine Amendment, that Article 2, Section 5, is not taken from the Blaine Amendment. Furthermore, they concluded, because the Blaine Amendment does not contain a general prohibition on the use of state property to benefit religion, Article 2, Section 5 of the Oklahoma Constitution cannot be seen as the Blaine Amendment. Those are the words of our justices. There's even more evidence, and I want to focus our attention to the language found in the Constitution of Sequoia. This constitution was proposed in 1905 by the 5 civilized tribes representing Indian Territory. Even though their attempt at statehood failed, the language found in Article 1, Section 6 sounds strikingly familiar to our current Oklahoma Constitution. No money shall ever be taken from the public treasury, directly or indirectly, in aid of any church, sect, or denomination of religion, or in aid of any priest, preacher, minister, or teacher thereof as much. Now, why would the 5 civilized tribes desire such a right for their citizens? I want to tell you a story of my own. It's from my Muskogee Creek great-grandmother, Eloise Bootnaw, and her sister Ruby. As young girls in eastern Oklahoma, they were sent to an agricultural school in northern Oklahoma. Those in charge made an attempt to drive out the Indian in order to save their souls. The girls' long hair was cut, they were beaten when they spoke their native language, Muskogee Creek, they were forced to attend Christian worship service, and publicly whipped if they failed to attend. All of this appalling and terrifying behavior was conducted by Christian missionaries funded by government and on government lands. We can now see why it was so important to Native people that separating church and state was included in their constitutional attempt in 1905 and later included in the Oklahoma Constitution in 1907. The Oklahoma Constitution was ratified by the U.S. Constitution in November 16, 1907, making Oklahoma, of course, the 46th state. When Oklahoma entered statehood, our leaders understood they needed to comply with federal mandates to join the Union. One such mandate is known as the Enabling Act of 1906. According to the Oklahoma Historical Society, the Enabling Act empowered the people of Oklahoma and Indian territories to elect delegates to a constitutional convention and set up a state capital temporary to govern. More so, the act included several stipulations that were required laws in order to enter statehood. There were 2 specific requirements dealing with religion. Freedom of religion was to be preserved, and the establishment of public schools, which were to be non-sectarian. By agreeing to these terms, Oklahoma was adopting the principles defined by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Let me close with this. When Article 2, Section 5 was written into the state's constitution, it seems clear the Blaine Amendment was not included into the Constitution based on the opinion of 2 state Supreme Court justices. At the same time, the statute certainly supports the concerns found in the Sequoia Constitution. Article 2, Section 5 was used to shape a Madisonian barrier, which was in the Virginia state statute, and a Jeffersonian wall that protected religious liberty for all Oklahoma citizens. Therefore, for me at least, a no vote on SQ 790 will uphold this important federal and state principle that protects religious liberty at both a national and state level. Thank you.
To answer the first question, if Article 2, Section 5 is not repealed by the people of Oklahoma, you will see a flood of litigation like the Prescott case. Whether that has to do with the Native American statue on the top of the Capitol, at the state flag that we've talked about, our state flag salute. We have a state flag salute that again talks about the symbols of peace on the flag that unite all people. Under the Supreme Court's decision, all of that in Oklahoma is unconstitutional. The decision was so bad, we had no choice but to say we have to remove Article 2, Section 5 that they rely upon, because they did not rely upon the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which again has those protections that Dr. Randall talked about. Just for a little bit of clarification, you had the 7-2 Prescott opinion, and then when he was talking about the Blaine Amendment, the discussion on the Blaine Amendment, that actually came when there was a request for a rehearing. Again, this opinion, this 2-page opinion, was so bad and had so many implications that the Attorney General said, will you guys please hear this again or reconsider and maybe clarify? And then what you had was this plurality of opinions that were all different. They said, we're not going to rehear it, but let's try and clarify what we meant. Well, some justices said, well, this is not a Blaine Amendment. Some said, well, this obviously came from the attempts to put Blaine Amendments in the state constitutions. There were some that said, well, we think that we overruled our prior opinion where we said it was okay to have a 50-foot cross, Christian cross, at the Oklahoma State Fairgrounds, where others said, well, you know, we really didn't consider the precedent that was set in that case. So you start to see the problem. The court had created such a mess with their interpretation of Article 2, Section 5, we have no choice but to get rid of it. Again, so does that mean now that we're going to be requiring people to attend religious services or classes or anything like that? Of course not. We're not going to cut off anybody's hair or force them to speak a certain language. That's not going to happen. And I'd like to point out, because we have a lot of talk often about Jefferson and Madison and about their separation of church and state. Nothing in Jefferson's writings or in his speeches, in his personal or public life, would ever indicate that he believed all mention or discussion of religion or acknowledgement of God should be removed from the public square. The Virginia law on religious freedom that you heard discussed today, that was written by Jefferson and passed by the Virginia Assembly, starts out, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free. That's how it starts. So was Jefferson offended at any acknowledgement of God in the public sphere? Obviously not. Would Jefferson be offended by and say that a monument to the Ten Commandments, whether it's located on the doors of the U.S. Supreme Court or on the Capitol grounds of Oklahoma, would be offensive or in violation of the U.S. Constitution or somebody's religious liberty? Absolutely not. And it's revisionist history to try and say that Jefferson would argue as such. To your second question, I don't know. I mean, again, this is not a religious issue. The monument has historical importance and should be put on the Capitol grounds, just like the seal of the great state of Oklahoma can have religious references, the flag can have religious references. It's fine, it's really not a religious argument at all.
Okay, I would like to address that, and because as I mentioned a moment ago in my remarks, there's another side to that story. While I appreciate his view of the history in which he claims, I would argue that he and those who support SQ 790 are revisionists in their understanding of things. It is pertinent to understand Madison and Jefferson in the context in which they lived. Madison and Jefferson were certainly separationists when it came to church and state. They understood through 100 years of Anglican and Puritan oppression in the colonies why those two entities needed to be separated. I could tell you stories all day of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Chesapeake Bay of how Baptists and Christians were persecuted, hung, burned at the stake by magistrates who were supported by their local faith groups. So there's two sides to this story. And the reason that Madison wanted to include a barrier and Jefferson wanted to include a wall between church and state is to protect people of faith. Because what church history has taught us, not only in this country but globally, is that when church and state begin to be entangled and mingled both ideologically and especially with resources, that one ends up ruling over the other in every circumstance. And in most part, religious minorities are often oppressed and ridiculed. And so I think that he's right. There's going to be legislation filed if it passes. But at the same time, if it doesn't pass, I think that there's going to be legislative action filed, regardless whether it is approved or not. So I think that that is absolutely accurate. But here's my main point. We live in a democracy. We have 3 branches of government. And so we are possibly taking a tool away from the Supreme Court to be able to interpret these cases. This is mind-boggling. Now, the case he was talking about regarding in Tulsa and the Henry Act, that was adjudicated. It was ruled on in this past year by the Supreme Court and ruled that it was legal. It wasn't a violation of separation of church and state. And so it's intact and it's safe. But let's not take away the Supreme Court's tool to be able to interpret the law as it is argued. Because sometimes you're going to win these cases and sometimes you're going to lose these cases. That's what it means to live in a democracy. And so that is vitally important in this particular state question. Now, regarding your second question, I see it myself. I see millennials flooding away from the church because church and state have become so intertwined. And that's both on the right and on the left. They are driven by their values and by what's important to them. But when it begins to be intertwined, that really just does not appeal to them whatsoever. So yes, from a faith standpoint, I think it has driven young people away from the church. I still, as a Baptist minister, I know what many of you are probably saying is, why in the world is a Baptist minister arguing against the 10 Commandments on the grounds of the state capitol? Well, for me, it is a religious issue. It really, really is. Because to say the 10 Commandments is not a religious document is really frustrating to me. Because the first part of the 10 Commandments is, do not have another God before me. Do not create idols.
I want to clarify.
No, I'm not finished.
But I didn't say it was not.
You did say
religious.
it's not a religious issue. For me, it is a religious issue.
Agreed. But the 10 Commandments is religious.
It is a religious
So
issue.
is the sacred pipe that's on our state flag.
That's not necessarily true. No language indicates that that's a sacred pipe. You are projecting your words upon that.
What kind
but
of pipe?
nowhere does it say.
What kind of pipe is
it? It's a Native American pipe, which they passed around, and which they led and made it. And so same thing with the olive branch about peace. I mean, it is a universal symbol It certainly is. It's about peace, but not necessarily religious language. Again, my point is, let the courts decide these things. Now, back to the religious question, and I'm almost finished, I know, is that for me as a Baptist minister, it is offensive when the state tries to use my faith to promote or to politicize any agenda that they have. I still believe in the words of Jesus when he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's. I also believe when he said, or try to understand when he said that we cannot have two masters. We'll be enslaved to one, no matter what. And so for me, it is a religious issue. It is a deep faith conviction of mine that we keep church and state separate so that a free church can thrive in a free state.
The fact is, we do live in a democracy, which means that, and in a republic, however you want to do, with three different distinct departments, the legislative branch makes the law, not the judicial branch. This tool, which is actually part of the Constitution, has been abused by the court. Not only in this ruling, but when we look at the way that the state has partnered with religious organizations. I think about one that I know of that does adoption and foster placement. And again, there's been this cooperative effort between a faith-based organization and the state to close down the shelter in Oklahoma County because there are so many people through these faith-based organizations that are able to take children into foster care. Under the decision of the Supreme Court, that's got to go. Community support grants from Oklahoma County that go into local communities to pay for senior nutrition services and things like that. If that's provided on a church property, guess what? That has to go. We can talk all we want about what happened 200 some odd years ago. That's not the issue. The issue is addressing the Prescott decision and what it means for our communities. Now, if you think that church and state is overly intertwined nowadays, I don't know what America you're living in compared to 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But again, that's not the issue. The Ten Commandments, if we want to talk about that, we can talk about that. Does it have a religious significance? Of course it does. So does the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And guess what we have in our statutes? A Good Samaritan law. It's got to go, right? That name is offensive, and it violates the separation of church and state. The Supreme Court opinion did not talk about the historical significance or context of the Ten Commandments. It said that doesn't matter. So the fact that the sacred pipe may or may not have been used by Native Americans just to get high at sometimes is irrelevant. It has sacred purpose. It violates Article 2, Section 5, according to our current Supreme Court's decision. How do we fix that? How do we make sure the state can continue to work with faith-based organizations to provide services in our community? You get rid of Article 2, Section 5. That's what living in a democracy is about. It's up to the people.
Okay, I'm going to let you take a brief response, and then we have time for one question after this that, with short answers, because it's really great conversation, but just short answers.
Native Americans pass around the pipe and hot. I think that's ridiculous. That's exactly what you just said. That's exactly what you just said. They all heard you. Second, what he is arguing is a red herring. All of these situations that he is floating out there there are certainly situations where church and state have worked together. Okay? No one's saying that there is an absolute, even Kennedy would say there's no really absolute separation. There are moments within history and even today where church and state work together for the betterment of the community. But do not take away a provision in the Oklahoma Constitution to allow courts to make that decision. Because that is what we're talking about. Taking away a sacred right and a sacred provision from the court system to not let them allow, not them to interpret what's going on in our state. If this is removed, there is going to be an open door for church and state to work together. And trust me on this, if this passes, the next piece of legislation you will see come from this body will be school vouchers. Guaranteed.